everyone, and welcome to Research Forum. We're so happy to see you back today after what was hopefully a restful Thanksgiving break. Today we have the great pleasure to have three speakers representing the scientific and operational leadership of the recently published LEVO-CTS trial, and they're going to give us a behind-the-scenes look at the good, the bad, and the ugly of this trial. So we're really excited to hear their perspectives on what went well and what maybe not so well. We'll be first hearing from John Alexander, who is a friend and colleague to many in this room. He's a cardiologist and professor of medicine at Duke, and also Vice Chief of Clinical Research in the Division of Cardiology, and directs cardiovascular research here at the DCRI. He's published extensively and served as the PI of numerous multi-center clinical trials, and also is the co-chair of the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative. So please join me in welcoming today's speakers.
We've sort of looked forward to this research forum for the last couple years as we are winding down the LEVO-CTS trial and thought about all the things we wanted to share. And we really do hope this is going to be a little bit of a lessons learned, and we are going to share some things that went great, some things that didn't go so well from a number of different perspectives that you'll hear. And one thing I want to highlight is these trials take a long time. As you guys who work on trials know, we started this in 2011 and finished it in 2017, so 6 years of work. And we're going to tell you a little bit of that story. So this is what, as I said, I'm going to start off telling you sort of the background behind the LEVO-CTS trial, and then present to you the main results really as they were presented publicly at the American College of Cardiology last year. And then Raj is going to give you a perspective on faculty, principal investigator lessons learned from the trial, as a faculty PI, and then Sandra's going to give a perspective on operational lessons learned, and we're going to do all that in 45, maybe 50 minutes, and have 10 minutes left for questions. So this all started in 2011 with a meeting at the Duke Clinical Research Institute between Bob Harrington, then our director of the DCRI, and three guys from a company called Fyxius Pharma, John Kelly, Doug Hay, and Doug Randall, and that was all of Fyxius Pharma. The whole company came here. They have no offices, so it was just the three of them. And they asked, and this I cut out of the confidentiality agreement. It was on March 25th, 2011 that we got our CDA in place. And they asked Bob the question, can you help us design and conduct a clinical trial to support US regulatory approval of Levosimendan, and I'll tell you more about Levosimendan in a little bit, in patients undergoing cardiac surgery. And we have no money. Yet. And so Bob's answer was, yes, of course, John can help you do that. So that's how this all started. And I then, a couple of days later, met with these guys, and we started. So Bob said, spend up to $250,000. And he created a fund coded the DCRI with no money in it and said, you can run this into the red up to $250,000 designing a trial. So I put together a team, Raj Mehta, Kevin Anstrom, who's sitting in the last row on the left back there, and a project leader named Shelley Miles, who some of you will remember. And we designed a very simple, very pragmatic trial with 3,000 patients undergoing coronary artery bypass surgery with an EF less than 45%, with an all-cause mortality endpoint. And then one of our faculty, Rob Harrison, helped us do a meta-analysis looking at Levosimendan in patients undergoing cardiac surgery, and I'll show you some data from that. That got published. But after 2 years of looking, Fyxius still had no money. And they didn't have the money to conduct this trial, which cost $30, $40 million all in to conduct. So back to the drawing board, we redesigned the trial. This is using what I call Caliph method method B, where you take your total dollars, which right now is 0, and redesign the trial to fit into that. So we enriched the risk of the population and broadened the outcome. We added valve patients, reduced the left ventricular ejection fraction, a marker of risk, down to 25% for CABG, 35% for valve surgery. We added other components to our endpoint, including mechanical assist device use, myocardial infarction, and dialysis. Came up with a sample size of 760 patients, which Fyxius thought they could raise the money to support. And then at that point, Fyxius combined, those three guys from Fyxius combined or took over a company called Oxygen, which was here in the park, and became Tenax Therapeutics. And they now had the money to run the trial. So we then started the trial. We had to assemble a project team. We didn't yet have a project team. They were all new. None of them had been involved for the last couple years in this planning. And we had our first of 5 project leaders. And Sandy, who you had introduced, was our last of 5 project leaders. So maybe you'll hear more about that in the operational piece. We identified US sites that did high-risk cardiac surgery. We had a new and growing sponsor team that had new, both good and bad ideas that we had to deal with about the design and operations of the trial. We started enrolling in September 2014, now 3 years after that first meeting. And enrollment was slower than expected, so we added some Canadian centers with our Canadian Vigor Center colleagues. And then we finished the trial. And the results weren't what we had expected. So with that, I'm going to show you the main results, and these are the same slides I presented at the American College of Cardiology meetings in 2017. These are disclosures. And so levosimendan is a calcium sensitizing inotrope that has 3 complementary effects. It's cardioprotective, prevents myocardial injury. It's inotropic, it helps the heart squeeze harder. And it's a vasodilator, it dilates peripheral blood vessels and therefore also helps blood flow forward better. It's approved in over 60 countries, but not the United States, and it's approved for treatment of acute heart failure. It's been used in over 1 million patients worldwide. There have been over 1,000 PubMed references related to levosimendan, and it's actually been studied in 35 randomized trials in cardiac surgery, but all small or had other significant limitations. And despite its approval in heart failure, it's used widely in Europe, both prophylactically and more commonly after cardiac surgery for people who have low cardiac output syndrome. So this was the analysis that Rob Harrison did. And from these other previous smaller trials, if you combine them all together, it looks like levosimendan reduces myocardial injury or myocardial infarction by about 5% absolute reduction. It reduces the need for dialysis by about a 5% absolute reduction. And it leads to a reduction in short-term mortality of about 4%. And these are large reductions in these endpoints short-term after cardiac surgery. So there's a lot of preliminary evidence out there suggesting it should have beneficial effects. So the objective of LEVO-CTS was to compare the efficacy and safety of levosimendan with placebo in patients with reduced left ventricular function undergoing cardiac surgery with cardiopulmonary bypass support. Pretty simple design. We took 760 planned patients undergoing CABG or CABG plus valve surgery with a reduced LV ejection fraction and randomized them preoperatively to receive either levosimendan dosed with a higher dose for 1 hour and then a lower dose for 24 hours extending through and after surgery, or placebo. We followed everybody through 30 days and then 90 days for a mortality follow-up. And all other therapies were given according to standard of care. Now our primary outcome, as you'll remember, we expanded it from just being all-cause mortality. So we had a dual and a quad primary outcome. The quad outcome was death, need for a mechanical assist device, perioperative myocardial infarction, or need for dialysis. And the dual endpoint, thought to be more clinically important and harder, was death or mechanical assist device use. We had secondary outcomes of low cardiac output syndrome and use of secondary inotropes, and then ICU length of stay, and safety outcomes including hypotension, atrial fibrillation, and then this important 90-day vital status, which we really thought of just as a safety outcome. So sample size, we needed 760 patients. To get 201 quad events, we estimated a 35% risk reduction with levosimendan. This sounds large in the cardiovascular world, but actually is substantially smaller than that meta-analysis suggested we might see. And we had 86% power to hit one of our co-primary outcomes. Our primary analysis was going to be modified intent to treat, including all randomized patients who received any study drug. And so we enrolled 880 patients. Ultimately, we increased the sample size a little bit because of a lower than expected event rate. We all but about 30 patients got study drug. Those weren't included in the primary analysis. Our vital status follow-up at 30 days was all but one patient, and we had pretty good follow-up of our 4-component outcome. And then at 90 days, we were missing 8 patients lost to follow-up for vital status overall. These are the baseline characteristics, about what you would expect: an average age of 65 years, mostly male, mostly white, an average ejection fraction of 25%, and this is a very high-risk group that really makes up the highest 5% or so risk of patients undergoing cardiac surgery in the United States. You can see 2/3 of our patients had CABG only, and about 10% had valve only, and the rest had CABG plus valve surgery. Levosimendan was started just about 20 minutes prior to surgery, and most patients got the full 24 hours of study drug. Some patients had it stopped a little bit early for a variety of reasons, many of which were just logistical. So this is our primary outcome. And as you can see, there was no effect of levosimendan on either the quad endpoint here on the left or the dual endpoint on the right. And actually on the dual endpoint of death or mechanical assist device use, it tends to go slightly in the wrong direction. And so when we first saw this results, we're like, oh, that's not what we expected. But a totally neutral study with really no effect of levosimendan. Now, when you start to look at the individual components of the primary endpoint, it gets a little bit more complicated. You can see that death and dialysis are both relatively rare, as we expected, but both go in the right direction with levosimendan. Myocardial infarction, which is the most frequent component of the endpoint, has really no effect. And mechanical assist device use actually goes in the wrong direction with levosimendan, and which has higher rates than with placebo. Now you'll remember that dialysis and mechanical assist device use are decisions that doctors make, and so may not be as objective endpoints as some of our clinical events like mortality. The drug did affect cardiac output. It's an inotrope. It's doing what it was supposed to do, and there is a highly statistically significant modest increase in average cardiac output during study drug infusion. And it improved some other measures, secondary measures. There was less low cardiac output syndrome, less use of secondary inotropes in patients receiving levosimendan, but no difference in ICU length of stay. The safety outcomes, which were part of why the drug didn't get approved in heart failure in the United States, actually look pretty good. There was a little bit numerically more hypotension and atrial arrhythmias with levosimendan, but not at all statistically significant, and relatively low rates, and no higher rates of more significant arrhymnias. And so this was all relatively straightforward until we saw the 90-day mortality curves. And so there's remember, this is a safety outcome, not one of our primary or secondary outcomes. And there was a highly clinically relevant 3%, not quite statistically significant reduction in all-cause mortality with levosimendan compared to placebo. So in a scientific venue, appropriately, we concluded that levosimendan, given prophylactically prior to surgery in patients with reduced LV function, had no effect on either our dual or quad endpoints. It was effective and safe as an inotrope, and if you compare it to the other drugs that are used in this setting, the other inotropes that we have clinically, the fact that it's safe and doesn't increase mortality is actually a positive. And then we had this in there as clinical implications because while not available in the United States, this drug is widely available and used in Europe. And so given its effect on cardiac output, low cardiac output syndrome, and other inotrope use, and the absence of adverse safety signals, levosimendan is a reasonable option to consider in patients undergoing cardiac surgery where you're trying to increase their cardiac output. And then we importantly recognized our steering committee data safety monitoring board, which was chaired by Bert Pitt, our teams at Tenax, the DCRI, the Canadian Vigor Center, and then 70 investigators from around the United States and Canada, and our 882 participants. and it was published simultaneously in the New England Journal of Medicine.